The year is 1981, a smog-choked, neon-drenched backlot in Burbank, California. A perfectionist British director is locked in a bitter war with his own mutinous crew, shooting night after grueling night in artificial rain. Today, we are dissecting the rain-slicked streets of Blade Runner. It is a haunting masterpiece born from a chaotic production rebellion, touched by real-world tragedy, and subjected to corporate butchering so severely it took 25 years to unearth the truth. Before we step into the spinner and ascend into the Los Angeles skyline, tell us, which version of Blade Runner did you see first? The one with the voiceover or the final cut? Leave your evidence in the comments below. The genesis of a nightmare. The journey began not with Ridley Scott, but with a humble, mind-bending novel by Philip K. Dick titled Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Actor-turned-writer Hampton Fancher drafted a script, but Hollywood didn't quite know what to make of it. It was too weird, too philosophical. It lacked the laser-blasting heroics of Star Wars, opting instead for existential dread. Enter Ridley Scott. Fresh off the massive claustrophobic success of Alien, Scott was originally slated to direct an adaptation of Dune. However, he was looking for a faster, more grounded distraction after the sudden, tragic passing of his older brother. He threw himself into the world-building of Blade Runner with an obsessive, almost punishing level of detail. To realize this vision, Scott needed architects of the future. He brought in Sid Mead, a legendary industrial designer who coined the term visual futurist. Mead was initially hired just to design the vehicles, the iconic flying spinners, but he couldn't help himself. He began drawing the dark, trash-filled streets and towering, retrofitted buildings around the cars. Scott was so blown away by these backgrounds that he essentially handed the visual Bible of the film over to Mead. They operated on a concept called retrofitting, the idea that the future wouldn't be shiny and new, but built directly on top of the decaying ruins of the past. But unlike George Lucas's guerrilla-style shoots in parking lots, Scott had a massive Warner Brothers backlot. He transformed the old New York street set into a dystopian nightmare. To hide the fact that they didn't have the budget to build towering physical skyscrapers, Scott used massive amounts of smoke, smog, and constant, freezing rain, the architects of light and sound. To capture this grim metropolis, Scott recruited cinematographer Jordan Cronenweth. Together, they pioneered a look that would birth the visual aesthetic of the cyberpunk genre. Cronenweth utilized intense shafts of light, neon reflections in puddles, and unmotivated backlighting. He shot the actors through smoke and rain to make the air itself feel heavy and toxic. But the visual atmosphere was only half of the equation. Blade Runner would be nothing without its heartbeat, provided by the Greek composer Vangelis. Unlike traditional film scoring, where an orchestra plays to a locked picture, Vangelis was creating the music simultaneously as the film was being edited. Sitting in his London studio surrounded by towering synthesizers, particularly the massive Yamaha CS80, he improvised directly to the raw footage. The result was a soundscape that felt both intensely futuristic and achingly ancient, a lonely, synth-drenched jazz that perfectly mirrored the isolation of Rick Deckard. Casting the future. Casting the film was equally tense and complex. While Harrison Ford stepped into the role of Rick Deckard, bringing a weary, film noir exhaustion to the character, the supporting cast was required to carry the philosophical weight of the narrative. For the role of Rachel, the experimental Nexus 6 replicant who believes she is human, Scott cast a 22-year-old newcomer named Sean Young. Young was visually stunning, possessing the exact 1940s femme fatale elegance Scott wanted. However, she was incredibly inexperienced, and her working relationship with Harrison Ford was famously icy. Their on-screen tension was real. The crew notoriously referred to their aggressive romantic scene as the hate scene. Then there was Edward James Olmos, who played the mysterious detective Gaff. Olmos fundamentally changed the texture of the film's universe. He researched the melting pot demographics of Los Angeles and realized that by 2019, the streets would be a linguistic collage. He personally invented City Speak, a frantic, improvised mashup of Hungarian, Japanese, Spanish, German, and French. It was Olmos who decided his character would taunt Deckard with tiny origami figures, a chicken, a matchstick man, and eventually, a silver unicorn. And of course, it was a Dutch actor, Rutger Hauer, who brought the rogue replicant Roy Batty to life. Hauer possessed a terrifying, charismatic physicality entirely distinct from the standard Hollywood villain. The t-shirt war and the trench. The relentless, wet, smoke-filled environment of the Burbank backlot led to a near mutiny. Ridley Scott, used to fast-paced British film crews who functioned with military hierarchy, clashed heavily with the unionized American film crew. The tension boiled over when a British magazine quoted Scott, saying he preferred working with UK crews because they simply said, "Yes, Governor," and didn't ask questions. In response, the American crew, exhausted, freezing, and tired of the endless takes, printed up T-shirts that read, "Yes, Governor, my ass." The entire lighting and camera department wore them to the set. Scott, never one to back down, retaliated by having his own T-shirt printed that said, "Xenophobia sucks." It became known in Hollywood lore as the legendary T-shirt war. The production famously spiraled over budget and over schedule. Financial backers stepped in, imposing strict deadlines and essentially firing Scott and his producer Michael Dealey, though they were allowed to finish the film under strict supervision. The author's blessing, and this is where the production's lore takes a tragic and beautiful turn. The film's original creator, author Philip K. Dick, had been notoriously critical of Hampton Fancher's early drafts of the script. He felt Hollywood was turning his existential novel into a standard, brainless detective story. However, a crucial rewrite by David Peoples brought the philosophical core back into focus. Still skeptical, Dick was invited by Ridley Scott to a private screening in late 1981. Scott showed him a special effects test reel, crafted by VFX wizard Douglas Trumbull, showing the fiery industrial hellscape of Los Angeles 2019, complete with the towering Tyrell Corporation pyramids and flying spinners. Dick was brought to tears. Tragically, Philip K. Dick suffered a stroke and died on March 2, 1982, just 3 months before the film's theatrical premiere. He never got to see the finished masterpiece that would immortalize his work, Tears in Rain. But Philip K. Dick's spirit lived on in the film's final, defining moment. The script originally called for Roy Batty to deliver a lengthy, high-tech, jargon-filled monologue before his death. Rutger Hauer felt the speech was far too long and over-explained the moment. The night before shooting, Hauer sat alone in his trailer, crossed out lines of dialogue, and added a single, haunting phrase of his own creation. As the sun was literally coming up over the backlot, ruining the artificial night they had carefully constructed, Hauer held a white dove and delivered the lines directly to Harrison Ford. It is widely considered the greatest unscripted addition in science fiction history, elevating the film from a stylish thriller into profound cinematic poetry. The shared universe mythology. Much like THX 138's bizarre connection to the Star Wars galaxy, Blade Runner has its own strange web of franchise mythology. Eagle-eyed viewers noticed that the computer screens inside Deckard's spinner vehicle displayed the exact same boot-up sequence, a red screen with "Purge" written across it, used in the escape pod of Ridley Scott's Alien. Years later, a spin-off film titled Soldier, written by Blade Runner co-writer David Peoples, featured a rusted Blade Runner spinner in a garbage dump, alongside references to the Tannhäuser Gate. This has fueled decades of intense fan theories. Are Alien and Blade Runner set in the exact same corporate dystopia? Is the Weyland-Yutani Corporation competing with the Tyrell Corporation? Ridley Scott himself has coyly hinted at the connection over the years. The Easter eggs are there, waiting to be analyzed. The golden flicker moment. The butchering. But the most fascinating mystery is the one that brings us to our golden flicker moment. After early test screenings in Dallas and Denver in late 1981, the studio executives at Warner Brothers and Tandem Productions panicked. The audience feedback cards were absolutely brutal. Viewers found the film too dark, too confusing, and the pacing too slow. More importantly, they found the ending far too ambiguous. They couldn't understand why Deckard just got on an elevator with a replicant as the doors slammed shut. Were they going to be hunted down? Were they safe? The financiers seized control of the film from Ridley Scott and demanded 2 catastrophic changes. First, they forced Harrison Ford to record a film noir-style voiceover to over-explain the plot to the audience. Second, the executives demanded a happy ending. They wanted to see Deckard and Rachel driving away into a bright, sunny landscape, completely ignoring the fact that Rachel had a 4-year lifespan. The problem was, Ridley Scott hadn't shot any sunny landscapes. The entire film was a dark, claustrophobic exercise in urban decay. In a desperate, bizarre move, the studio contacted legendary director Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick had recently finished shooting The Shining, and he was famous for shooting exhaustive amounts of footage. He had hours of leftover, unused helicopter B-roll of sweeping, sunny mountains from the opening sequence of his horror film. Warner Brothers literally spliced the bright green, sunny B-roll from The Shining into the end of Blade Runner, overlaid Harrison Ford droning about how Rachel was miraculously special and wouldn't die, and created a jarring, entirely out-of-place happy ending. This is the ultimate golden flicker moment. For an entire decade, the 1982 theatrical cut, complete with the lifeless voiceover and The Shining's mountains, was the only version of Blade Runner the world knew. The studio had fundamentally altered the DNA of the film, erasing its ambiguous, haunting tone to appease a test audience. It was an act of cinematic vandalism, the 7 faces of Blade Runner. But unlike George Lucas, who used digital technology to alter his original work and bury the theatrical cut of THX 138 forever, the fate of Blade Runner moved in the exact opposite direction. The film's path to redemption is an unprecedented story of archaeological restoration. In truth, there are roughly 7 distinct versions of Blade Runner that have existed over the years, but the Renaissance began in 1990. A 70mm workprint of Ridley Scott's original pre-studio interference vision was accidentally discovered. It belonged to an archivist and was mistakenly screened at the Fairfax Theater in Los Angeles. The crowd went wild. The atmosphere was completely different. The oppressive voiceover was gone. The jarring, sunny ending was gone. It was a darker, meaner, more introspective film. The demand generated by this accidental screening was so overwhelming that Warner Brothers realized there was money to be made. They allowed Scott to officially release the director's cut in 1992. This version stripped away the voiceover, deleted the happy ending, and added the infamous unicorn dream sequence. This single insertion, a brief shot of a unicorn running through a forest, changed the entire meaning of the film. Combined with Gaff leaving the origami unicorn at Deckard's door, it provided a vital, undeniable clue that ignited the decades-long debate. Rick Deckard is, himself, a replicant. Gaff knew Deckard's implanted dreams, just as Deckard knew Rachel's. However, because Scott was busy making Thelma and Louise at the time, the 1992 director's cut was actually assembled by film restorer Michael Eric. Scott gave notes, but he wasn't fully in control. It wasn't until 2007, 25 years after the original release, that Warner Brothers gave Ridley Scott complete financial and creative control to produce the final cut. In this definitive version, Scott painstakingly restored the color grading, fixed continuity errors, including digitally matching the face of Joanna Cassidy onto her stunt double during the Jorah retirement scene, and presented the film exactly as he intended it to be seen in 1981. The inescapable legacy. Blade Runner was a massive box office failure upon its initial release in June 1982. It was misunderstood by critics, entirely overshadowed by the release of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and completely ignored by audiences who were drawn to the cheerful, family-friendly optimism of Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which came out the exact same month. Yet, its influence became inescapable. It birthed the cyberpunk genre. Its aesthetic blueprint, the neon kanji, the endless rain, the retrofitted technology, the synthesis of organic and artificial life, can be seen in everything from The Matrix and Ghost in the Shell to Akira and Altered Carbon. More importantly, it stands as the ultimate testament to artistic perseverance. It proved that a film could survive severe corporate mutilation, be buried by the mainstream, and eventually be excavated, celebrated, and restored to its true, intended form by sheer will of the audience and its creator. While we have investigated the rain-soaked streets of the production today, We have barely scratched the surface of the forensic clues hidden deeply within the film's narrative architecture. We could track the exact timeline of the replicant debate, analyze the deep-lore alien universe connections, dissect the intricate psychology behind every piece of origami left by Gaff, or break down the mind-bending visual effects achieved entirely without CGI. The archives of cinema are vast, and the neon lights of 2019 will always be waiting. Keep your eyes on the shadows, watch the skies for spinners, and as always, thank you for stepping into the flickering light.